Welcome to Sinister Truths. Tonight, I'm pulling you into a story so brutal, so shocking, that historians still whisper about it with trembling voices. This is the tale of a man who was once chained, beaten, and owned, yet transformed himself into the most feared mountain ghost of the American South. A man whose footsteps made hunters turn back, whose shadow made slave catchers abandon their missions, and whose name mothers refused to say out loud after dark. Before we begin, tell me in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day you're tuning in, morning, afternoon, or late at night. And don't forget to subscribe to Sinister Truths for more chilling stories. The year was 1843, and the Carolina lowlands were drowning in heat so thick it felt like the air itself wanted to collapse. The mud baked into clay by noon, only to soften again under the weight of evening storms that never came soon enough. Cicadas screamed like broken machinery, their endless buzzing mixing with the distant groans of ox carts and the sharp crack of overseers' whips. On a crumbling plantation infamous for its cruelty, a place where laughter had never been allowed to exist and hope died faster than crops during drought, stood a man named Jonah Briggs. Sweat dripped from his back in rivers as he pushed through another day of torture. The sun blistered his skin like punishment for sins he never committed. Jonah had been born into chains. His first memory wasn't of a mother's voice or gentle touch, but of the clink of iron links dragging across a splintered wooden floor as he crawled for the first time. He had never known freedom, only the sting of leather slicing across flesh, the crushing weight of iron shackles gnawing into bone, and the constant threat of death hanging over him like a shadow with teeth. But Jonah was not just strong. Many men on the plantation were strong. What made him different was his silence. A deep, deliberate quietness that made overseers uncomfortable because they couldn't break him the way they broke others. He listened more than he spoke, and he watched everything with a sharpness that unsettled anyone who dared look into his eyes. He memorized the guards' patterns, not just their steps, but the rhythm of their boredom. He noticed the dogs' resting times, the moments when their growls softened to whimpers as they drifted into sleep. He spent years learning the plantation like a creature studying its cage, testing each bar for weakness. He saw the fence boards that warped after rain, the locks that rusted in the humidity, the nights when wind rattled the shutters loud enough to mask the sound of a careful footstep, and while others groaned, prayed, or fought back in desperate bursts that only brought more suffering, Jonah stayed still. He shaped himself into the image the overseers wanted to see, a broken man, dull-eyed, obedient, defeated. He lowered his head when they walked past, forced himself not to tense when the whip struck someone else, and pretended his spirit had been buried long ago. But inside, he counted every moment, storing fury the way dry wood stores fire. The overseers believed silence meant surrender. They thought stillness meant stupidity. They couldn't have been more wrong. Jonah was waiting, not for mercy, because mercy did not exist on that land, but for an opening. Even the cruelest systems left cracks. And Jonah Briggs had been watching those cracks widen year after year. Everything changed one night, a night thick with the smell of rain that never came, when the overseer made a mistake so small it should have meant nothing. A single iron gate left unlatched, not wide open, not obvious, just enough that the lock didn't fully click when he shoved it closed. Another mistake followed, layered on top like fate was stacking opportunities. A guard too drunk to stand straight, slumped over his post with his hat tilted forward, snoring loud enough to be heard over the rustling cane fields. And then the biggest miracle of all, a dog that didn't bark. Old Bristle, a hound known for his viciousness, lay curled under the guard's chair, belly rising and falling in deep sleep. Jonah had never once seen the dog so still. For a moment, Jonah wondered if he was dreaming, if exhaustion had finally cracked his mind. But the night air was too sharp, too real, too full of possibility for dreams. Jonah didn't move at first. He stood perfectly still, listening to the world. He felt it shift around him like a living thing, whispering in his ear, nudging him forward. Destiny rarely spoke loudly. It was a soft breath, a tremor in the ground, a small voice asking if he was brave enough to stand. Jonah's heart hammered so hard he thought the guard might wake just from hearing it. Every part of him screamed that this was madness. The woods beyond the plantation were filled with snakes, wolves, patrollers, slave catchers, and worse. Runaways were dragged back every month, broken, bloodied, sometimes missing limbs as warnings to the rest. But Jonah had spent too many years pretending to be a ghost. Tonight he would become one. He took a single step, then another. His bare feet made no sound, moving with the practiced grace of a man who had rehearsed escape in his mind 1,000 times. The moonlight slid through the trees like a silver blade, illuminating the path that could either save him or destroy him. Jonah didn't run at first. He walked, slow and steady, every muscle coiled tight. He felt the world watching him, waiting to see whether he would falter. The heat of the day had broken, replaced by a thick, suffocating humidity that hugged his skin and made every breath feel heavier. Yet Jonah moved like a shadow slipping free from its owner, inching closer to the gate, closer to the unlatched promise of freedom. He could smell the iron, smell the rust, taste the metallic tang of fear on his tongue. One wrong move, one snapped twig, one unexpected noise could end everything. But Jonah had spent his entire life training for this moment. Every blow he endured had sharpened him. Every insult had steeled him. Every scar had taught him what pain could and could not do to him. When he reached the gate, he froze, not because of fear, but because he wanted to listen one last time. Crickets hummed in the grass. The guard snored louder than before. Old Bristle twitched in his sleep, paws moving slightly as if running through some distant dream. Jonah's fingers slowly curled around the iron bar. It was warm from the day's sun, but slick with humidity. He lifted it just enough to keep it from scraping the ground. Then he slid through. It was like passing from one world to another. Inside the plantation, every breath belonged to someone else. Outside the gate, breath had a different sound, a different taste. It was heavier, yes, but it was his. The moment the gate closed behind him, Jonah felt something in his chest break open. Not fear, not panic, but a strange, terrifying hope. Yet he didn't allow himself to run. Not yet. He knew the guard might shift, the dog might stir, a window might creak. Jonah walked for nearly 50 yards, slow as drifting smoke. Only when he reached the line where the packed dirt road met the marsh grass did he finally stop holding his breath. And that was when Destiny's whisper became a roar. Run. Jonah bolted into the darkness. The ground tore at his calloused feet, mud splashing against his legs as he sprinted into the unknown. His lungs burned, his muscles protested, sweat ran down his face so fast it stung his eyes. But he didn't stop. Behind him nothing stirred, not yet. The guard remained slumped, unaware that history had just cracked open. Jonah didn't look back. If he looked, he knew hesitation might grab him by the throat. So he ran with the desperation of a man chasing the first taste of life he had ever known. The road dissolved into marshland. Thick reeds whipped against his legs as he forced his way forward. Frogs croaked, insects swarmed, and the scent of stagnant water filled his nose. He stumbled into knee-deep mud but used the muck to mask his tracks. Mosquitoes pierced his skin from every angle, but pain meant nothing. Ahead, the forest waited like a silent beast with open jaws. Jonah plunged into the trees. Branches snapped as he pushed through, leaving streaks of blood on the bark. Each wound reminded him he was alive. He ran until the moon dipped behind clouds and the world went black. He ran until he couldn't hear his own breath over the pounding of his heart. Only when his legs finally gave out did he collapse beside a fallen log, chest heaving, muscles shaking. For the first time in his life, Jonah Briggs lay on the ground without chains on his wrists. Sweat soaked his skin, mud plastered his hair, his throat felt torn from breathing so hard. Yet he smiled, a raw, cracked, exhausted smile. Freedom wasn't a calm thing. It was violent, explosive, terrifying. And Jonah had stepped into it with nothing but instinct and courage. He didn't know where he would go. He had no map, no plan, no allies hidden in the woods. All he had were the stories whispered by old men in the fields, stories about mountains far north where no slave catcher dared to venture. Jonah didn't know if those legends were true, but he had nothing else. The plantation was behind him, death was behind him. Everything he feared was behind him. Ahead was only darkness, danger, and possibility. Jonah pushed himself upright, shaking but determined. He wiped blood and sweat from his face, feeling the earth cling to him like armor. He listened to the forest. Owls hooted softly, leaves rustled under tiny creatures. The wind whispered through the branches like an old friend welcoming him home. Jonah took a long breath, then another. He rose to his feet with the quiet certainty of a man who understood that this night was only the beginning. He stepped deeper into the forest, leaving behind the life that had been forced on him, and walking toward the life he would build with his own hands, no matter how brutal the path ahead. Jonah Briggs didn't know he would become a legend. He didn't know the mountains would shape him into something more than a runaway slave. He didn't know the South would one day whisper his name in fear. All he knew was this: he had taken his first step into the darkness, toward a life that might kill him, but would never enslave him again. Jonah ran until the moon vanished and his lungs screamed for mercy, until each step felt like it might split his bones apart. The night wrapped around him like a thick shroud, and the trees above formed a tangled ceiling that swallowed every trace of moonlight. He pressed through swamps where snakes coiled around his ankles, their cold scales sliding across his skin before disappearing into the water. Branches tore open his flesh, ripping thin lines of blood that ran down his legs and arms, but pain meant nothing to him now. Pain was familiar, almost comforting compared to the hands that once chained him, the eyes that watched him with hatred, the voices that barked orders meant to strip him of everything human. Pain was not his enemy. It reminded him he was still alive, still moving, still choosing for the first time in his existence. His breath came ragged, the air thick with the scent of wet soil, rotting leaves, and stagnant pools. Sweat slid down his back like oil, mixing with the grime and mud that clung to him. Every sound felt magnified. The rustle of reeds, the distant croak of frogs, the soft splash of unseen creatures slipping into the dark water. Birds erupted from the branches when he stumbled through, their wings beating frantically before vanishing into the night. Jonah didn't slow. He didn't dare. He had no plan, no map, no food, and no allies. The world beyond the plantation might as well have been another planet, one filled with dangers he couldn't predict, but he welcomed that uncertainty. Anything was better than the certainty of the whip, the iron, the endless days of labor beneath a punishing sun. All Jonah carried with him were the whispered legends he'd heard since childhood, stories passed from one enslaved man to another when the overseers weren't listening. Men too old to work would sit near the edges of the fields at night, their voices low and trembling as they spoke of a wilderness deep in the southern mountains, a place untouched by white men's boots. They called it different names: Spirit Ridge, Shadow Pass, the High Teeth, but the meaning was always the same: a sanctuary carved by nature itself, a fortress of cliffs, caves, and forests so wild that even the bravest hunters avoided it, a land where the spirits of the hunted protected those who had nowhere else to go. Jonah didn't know if the stories were true. Maybe they were just tales told to comfort the hopeless. Maybe they were myths created to keep men from giving up entirely. But right now, they were the only guide he had, the only light in a world of choking darkness. The sky was changing above him, though Jonah barely noticed through the dense canopy. Clouds rolled in, swallowing what little starlight remained. The air grew heavier, charged with the promise of rain. Jonah welcomed the storm. Rain would wash away his tracks, drown his scent, confuse the dogs if they were set loose. And they would be. He knew that as surely as he knew his own name. The moment the plantation discovered his absence, chaos would erupt like fire, whistles would blow, men would yell, doors would slam, saddles would be strapped to horses. Torches lit, rifles loaded, dogs unleashed with foam dripping from their jaws. Jonah could almost hear it happening already, even though he was miles away. The overseers would not tolerate the embarrassment of a runaway, especially not one as strong and defiant as Jonah. They would hunt him with everything they had, but he had a small advantage. He had left in the deepest part of the night, slipping away like smoke before anyone stirred. If he could put enough distance between himself and the plantation before dawn, his chances, small as they were, might taper into something real: survival, freedom. A future he had never been allowed to imagine. The swamps thickened as he moved north. Mud tugged at his feet like greedy hands trying to pull him under. Thorned vines snagged at his shirt, tearing holes through the already thin fabric. The air buzzed with insects. Mosquitoes swarmed him in clouds, feasting on every exposed part of his skin. Jonah slapped them away only when necessary. Wasting energy was a luxury he didn't have. Every ounce of strength mattered. Every step took him closer to the mountains, to the place the elders had described with awe in their voices. He could still hear them. Old Isaac, whose back was bent like a broken tree but whose voice carried the weight of truth. "The mountains ain't like anywhere else," he had once whispered. "The mountains got eyes, boy. They watch, they judge, but they don't let evil cross their borders without a fight." Others nodded, their faces illuminated by the dim glow from a cooking fire. "Heard of men go up there and never come back. Not 'cause they died, but 'cause they found something better than life down here," another man had murmured. "Ain't no patrollers up there, ain't no chains, ain't no overseers, just freedom wrapped in stone and wind." Those stories had planted something in Jonah, something dangerous, something forbidden. Hope. Now that hope pulled him forward like an invisible rope tied around his chest, dragging him through exhaustion and terror. Every direction he looked was filled with death. If he turned west, he would run into old hunting trails patrollers knew well. If he turned east, he would hit the marshlands where gators lay in wait. If he turned back, he'd return to chains. But north was possibility. North was the unknown. And the unknown was the only place that had ever offered him even a whisper of freedom. Lightning flashed above him, briefly illuminating the forest floor. It cast a white glow over twisted roots, fallen logs, and the shimmering surface of shallow pools. Jonah used the moment to find a firmer path through the swamp, stepping carefully over roots and sinking only slightly into the mud. Thunder followed, rolling across the sky like a distant drum. He flinched at first, instinctively expecting the overseer's voice to follow, yelling commands. But then he remembered, no one owned him anymore. No one commanded him. The thunder belonged to nature, not to men. Rain began to fall, slowly at first, then in heavy sheets that hammered the leaves and soaked Jonah to the bone. The cool drops felt like salvation, washing the sweat and grime from his face, cooling the fire in his muscles. He tilted his head back, letting the rain pour into his open mouth. He drank greedily, his throat burning with thirst. Water ran down his chest, dripping from his chin, and seeping into the cuts on his arms, making them sting. He didn't care. He felt more alive than he ever had. The rain was cleansing him, washing away not just his scent or his tracks, but the last traces of the man he had been forced to be. He continued north, guided by instinct and memory rather than direction. The trees began to change, the swamp thinned, replaced by firmer ground and rocky soil. Tall pines rose around him, their branches whispering secrets as the wind passed through them. Jonah moved quickly, though his legs trembled with fatigue. He didn't know how many miles he had covered since fleeing the plantation. Time felt distorted, stretched thin by adrenaline and fear. All he knew was that he needed to keep moving until the sun rose, because sunrise was danger. Sunrise meant search parties. Sunrise meant dogs. Sunrise meant death. He crossed a shallow stream, the water icy against his ankles. Each step sent shocks through his body, but the cold helped keep him awake. He waded through it until the current pushed harder against him. Then he climbed up the opposite bank and collapsed to his knees, gasping. He swallowed hard, forcing his breath to steady. He couldn't afford to break down. Not yet. Not here. The mountains were still far away. He needed to reach the foothills before dawn. He pushed himself to his feet again, using a tree trunk for support. He stumbled forward, leaning heavily on the roots and rocks. Rain dripped from his hair into his eyes, blurring his vision. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, smearing mud across his cheek. He thought of the plantation, picturing the chaos that would erupt when someone discovered his absence. He imagined the overseer shouting orders, the guards scrambling into action, the dogs baying loudly. He knew they would search every inch of land within miles, but the rain would erase his scent, and the storm would discourage them from going too deep into the wild. He kept moving until he reached a thicket of brush so dense he had to crawl beneath it. Sharp branches scraped his back, tearing his shirt further. He dragged himself through, emerging on the other side covered in leaves and mud. He looked around and realized the trees were spaced differently now, wider, taller, more ancient. The ground sloped gently upward, and Jonah Briggs, covered in mud, blood, rainwater, sweat, and hope, walked toward them with the determination of a man who had already died once and refused to die again. He left behind a trail of blood, broken shackles, and a plantation that erupted into chaos by sunrise, and ahead of him lay a world waiting to test every piece of his soul. By the time Jonah reached the first rise of the Appalachian foothills, he was half-starved and nearly delirious, stumbling through a world that no longer felt real. His vision shimmered at the edges, and every sound in the forest seemed stretched, sharpened, echoing through his skull like far-off thunder. The trees loomed over him, towering, unbroken ancient sentinels that had watched centuries of storms and bloodshed and still stood unmoving. He felt small beneath them, smaller than he ever felt on the plantation, smaller than he ever felt under a white man's whip. The world around him seemed too large to understand, too wild to belong to anyone. But Jonah pushed forward because he had no other choice. The alternative was death, and death had stalked him since the moment he slipped into the darkness behind the smokehouse and ran. His stomach cramped so hard he had to lean against a tree just to breathe. He'd eaten nothing but berries and half-rotten apples for 3 days, and even those had scraped his throat like sand. His lips were cracked, bleeding. His hands shook. But the forest kept whispering with its endless chorus of rustling leaves and snapping twigs, urging him to keep going, keep moving, keep surviving. He didn't understand the forest's language yet, but he felt it pressing against him, testing him, judging him, deciding whether he deserved to live. The first night he slept curled at the base of a sycamore tree, shivering violently while the distant cries of animals, strange, haunting, predatory, kept jolting him awake. He'd grown up surrounded by farmland, swamps, and human cruelty. He'd never known a wilderness so deep it felt like the earth had swallowed him whole. But on the second night, when he pushed deeper into the mountains and found a narrow cave carved into the rock like a hidden mouth, he squeezed inside and curled up tight, his shoulders pressed against cold stone. The night air bit into his skin like needles, but the cave protected him from the wind and from the eyes of hunters, both human and animal. His body hurt in ways he had no words for. His feet were blistered raw. His back burned from where a whip had torn into him hours before he escaped. His legs trembled uncontrollably. But he slept, and for the first time, the mountain watched him without hostility, only curiosity. By the 4th day, Jonah's fear began to thin like smoke drifting away into open air. Hunger still clawed at him, but his senses were awakening in ways he couldn't explain. He started noticing patterns, how deer avoided certain trails, how the sound of birds falling silent meant something larger was approaching, how the wind carried scents that told their own stories. He learned by necessity. He learned because the mountain would kill him if he didn't. Yet he also learned because something inside him, something buried beneath years of servitude, was finally rising to the surface. He was not meant to obey out here. He was meant to adapt. He watched the wolves first from afar. At dawn he saw their silhouettes against the ridge, 3 dark shapes moving with eerie fluidity, their bodies silent except for the soft crunch of leaves beneath their paws. He kept his distance, knowing they could tear him apart in seconds, but he studied them the way he once studied the overseer's footsteps. Wolves wasted nothing. They were deliberate, precise. They paused when the wind shifted. They changed direction with purpose. They stopped, listened, smelled, then moved in complete unity. Jonah tried to mimic their stillness, their awareness, their patience. It wasn't perfect. He was clumsy and desperate. But each day he grew a little steadier. He learned to move quietly, testing each patch of ground before placing his weight. He learned to crouch low when danger rustled through the trees. He learned to freeze instead of fleeing, to breathe shallowly instead of gasping in panic. His heartbeat slowed, his mind sharpened, his body softened into the rhythm of the wilderness, as if the mountain were stripping away every part of him that belonged, to chains and commands and fear. The first stream he found saved him. He heard it before he saw it, an unbroken murmur weaving through the silence like a promise. When he stumbled down the slope and saw the water glinting between moss-covered stones, his knees nearly buckled. He collapsed at the bank, cupping handfuls of icy water to his mouth, drinking until his throat stopped burning and his head stopped spinning. Then he washed his face, letting the cold sting his skin awake. He splashed his arms, his neck. The mountain water felt pure, untouched by human cruelty. For a moment he felt reborn. As he followed the stream deeper into the forest, he found tracks, deer, raccoons, even bear. He walked carefully, knowing each footprint had meaning. Each broken branch told a story about what had passed through before him. The plantation had stripped him of his ability to make choices. The mountain forced him to make thousands each day. Food became his next lesson. He experimented cautiously. Some berries made his stomach churn. Others filled him with jittery energy. He forced himself to remember their colors, their shapes, their leaves, telling himself that knowledge was survival, and survival was freedom. He discovered roots buried beneath soft soil, bitter but edible. He found mushrooms growing on fallen logs, some he recognized as deadly from stories whispered by the older slaves. But he tested new ones with the careful hesitation of a man who knew one wrong bite meant the end. When the wolves hunted, he watched from a ridge or from the concealment of thick brush. They moved together, communicating with body language more subtle than words. They worked as one organism, each wolf anticipating the next. When they brought down a deer, Jonah listened to the snarls and yelps, the tearing of flesh, the thumps of hooves against earth. He wasn't horrified. He was learning. Death in the wild wasn't cruelty. It was balance. And balance was more honest than anything he'd ever known. He started sleeping differently, too. Before the mountains, sleep meant vulnerability. At the plantation, closing his eyes meant risking a beating or waking to new torment. Here, sleep was an agreement with the forest. He slept lightly, never sinking too deep, waking at the faintest shift in the wind. His ears sharpened, his skin tingled at every vibration of the earth. The mountain was training him without mercy, but with truth. Days turned into weeks, though Jonah didn't count time the way he used to. His world no longer revolved around the overseer's bell or the rising sun over the fields. Instead, he organized his life around rivers, animal migrations, and the growth of edible plants. His body hardened, his legs grew stronger, his arms steadied. He didn't recognize himself when he caught glimpses of his reflection in still pools. His face was leaner, sharper. His eyes were clearer. The boy who had fled in terror was dissolving, replaced by someone he had never been allowed to become. One evening, as he crouched near a fallen log searching for grubs, he sensed movement behind him before he heard it. His body tensed instinctively, every muscle going taut. Slowly he raised his head. A wolf stood 10 paces away, massive, its coat silver-gray with streaks of black, its eyes glowing like embers in the dimming light. Jonah froze, breathing shallowly. The wolf's gaze did not waver. It studied him with an intelligence that unnerved him, as if it saw the part of him that didn't belong here and the part of him that did. For several seconds, man and wolf faced each other, two creatures forged from suffering, both learning how to survive. Then the wolf turned and walked away without a sound, disappearing into the thicket. Jonah exhaled shakily. The encounter should have terrified him, but instead it filled him with an odd sense of acceptance. The mountain was acknowledging him, maybe not welcoming him, but recognizing him. His transformation wasn't clean or easy. Some days he woke dizzy from hunger, forcing himself to forage for hours before finding anything edible. Other days storms raged across the mountains, lightning fracturing the sky while rain hammered the trees like gunfire. He hid beneath overhangs of rock, shivering as the wind howled like angry spirits. But he endured. And with each storm that passed, each night he survived, each meal he managed to scrape from the earth, he felt the mountain shaping him, molding him into something stronger. Human tracks began to terrify him more than any predator. Once he spotted a group of hunters far below a ridge, 2 white men with rifles slung across their backs and dogs sniffing along the forest floor. Jonah dropped flat, burying himself under branches and leaves, waiting motionless while fear constricted his throat. The dogs barked at something faint, but ultimately followed a different scent. Jonah stayed hidden until nightfall, his body trembling not with fear of the men but with realization. He no longer belonged to their world. The wild had claimed him, in its own harsh way. But the forest wasn't only teeth and hunger. It had moments of unexpected beauty, sunlight filtering through the leaves like molten gold, deer crossing a meadow with breathtaking grace, fireflies drifting through the night like floating embers. Jonah found peace in those moments, a peace he had never known on the plantation, a peace he didn't think slaves were allowed to feel. But out here, nature didn't care about ownership. It didn't care about skin color or the scars on his back. It only cared whether he learned its rules. Over weeks, Jonah constructed a kind of shelter within a narrow cave high up the slope. He cleared debris, lined the floor with leaves and animal hides he scavenged from abandoned kill sites, and positioned stones strategically to block wind. It wasn't comfortable, but it felt like a home, a secret home the world could not touch. When he sat inside, listening to the distant roar of the river and the rustle of nocturnal creatures, he felt a strength growing in him, a new identity taking root. He wasn't just a runaway anymore. He wasn't prey. He could tell from the silence when the forest was holding its breath before danger. The mountain was no longer punishing him, it was instructing him, and he listened with reverence. One late autumn evening, Jonah stood atop a ridge watching the sun bleed into the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. The cold wind threaded through his hair, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. He looked out at the endless expanse of mountains, valleys, rivers, shadows and light, a land too vast to own, too fierce to tame, too ancient to bow to any man. In that moment, Jonah realized something he never thought possible. He was no longer surviving the mountain. He was belonging to it. Whatever he had been before, slave, runaway, property, no longer existed. The forest had stripped him raw and rebuilt him with its honest brutality. It had carved away his fear, sharpened his will, strengthened his spirit. The mountain had not been kind, but it had been true. And Jonah Briggs, once broken, once hunted, once beaten, had become its most devoted student, shaped by nature's cruelty and guided by its unyielding wisdom. The forest did not love him, it did not protect him, but it respected him because he survived. And in surviving, Jonah found something more powerful than freedom. He found himself soon. Whispers began spreading through the small towns and settlements that skirted the lower edges of the Appalachian foothills. At first, people thought it was just rumor, the exaggerated stories of frightened merchants, hunters, and laborers trying to make sense of strange occurrences in the mountains. But the tales refused to die, growing darker and more consistent with every retelling. Hunters swore they had glimpsed a dark figure moving across cliff edges with impossible grace, vanishing like smoke when they tried to approach. The figure was always alone, but somehow it seemed to dominate the wilderness around him. Birds would take sudden flight when he appeared, deer would freeze mid-step, and wolves would retreat, as if acknowledging some unspoken authority. Some claimed the man, or creature, could climb cliffs barehanded, leap across ravines in a single bound, and disappear into shadows no matter how bright the day. The mere thought of encountering him made experienced hunters pause mid-step, their hearts pounding as though anticipating the strike of a predator they could not see. Merchants traveling between the towns were the next to spread the stories. They returned from long journeys along the mountain passes, their wagons heavy with trade goods, only to report feeling eyes upon them, even when the forests appeared empty. Some said the figure moved silently through the treetops, crouched high in the branches like a shadowy sentinel. Others swore they had glimpsed a dark face peering from a cave's mouth, watching them, calculating their every move. There were nights when men slept uneasily in roadside inns or barns, hearing the snapping of twigs, the faint exhale of breath that was not theirs, the soft thud of someone, or something, moving in the darkness. Some merchants abandoned their trade entirely, unwilling to risk another night along the ridges. Towns whispered about the disappearances, the odd shadows, the feeling of being hunted by something not entirely human, but the most terrifying reports came from the slave catchers. These were men whose livelihoods depended on pursuing the desperate, the hunted, and those who had been stripped of all protection. They were accustomed to violence, accustomed to the screams of men in chains, accustomed to bending others to their will. Yet, when they ventured too far north into the mountains, something happened that shook them to their core. Some never returned. Their companions would find only shredded coats snagged on jagged branches, rifles broken in half as if wielded against them, boots trampled in the mud while the rest of their bodies seemed to vanish without a trace. Those who came back alive were pale, trembling, and silent for days, their eyes haunted by a terror they could not describe. They refused to speak of what had hunted them, and even when pressed, they only muttered that the mountains were alive, that a shadow moved with intent, that death had a new face. By the time townsfolk began piecing together these incidents, a name had already emerged. They called him the Black Phantom of the Peaks. It was a title whispered in fear around hearths and tavern tables, repeated in trembling voices by those brave or foolish enough to recount what they had seen. Some described the Black Phantom as a demon, a cursed soul born from the forest itself, sent to punish trespassers and kill those who dared hunt in the mountains. Others called him a guardian, a protector of the hidden wilds who struck without warning to defend the innocent or punish cruelty. He existed in stories as much as he did in the forests, a living myth whose existence people refused to challenge because to do so was to court death. The truth, however, was far simpler. Jonah Briggs was a man who refused ever to be hunted again, a man who had known chains, whips, and overseers' cruelty, and who had sworn to himself that no one, no white man, no hunter, no slave catcher, would ever exert power over him again. He had fled into the mountains not simply to escape, but to transform, to take the agony, fear, and rage he had endured, and forge them into something stronger than any man had ever imagined. Every movement, every strike, every step he took was a lesson in survival, honed over months in the unforgiving wilderness. By the time the rumors began spreading through towns and villages, Jonah had become more than a man. He had become a force. Those who entered his domain learned quickly what it meant to disrespect the boundaries he set. Hunters who ignored the whispered warnings, found themselves lost in terrain that seemed familiar one moment and impossible the next. Trails would vanish beneath tangled roots, and cliffs would rise where they remembered gentle slopes. Jonah learned to use the landscape like a weapon, bending it to his will. He moved with perfect understanding of where rocks could be loosened, where logs could snap, where trees could conceal him while he watched intruders stumble helplessly past. No patrol was safe, no tracking method effective. The forests themselves became an extension of Jonah's presence, hiding him, aiding him, and ensuring that those who tried to harm him found only fear, confusion, and sometimes death. And death was deliberate. Jonah's vengeance was not indiscriminate. It was calculated, precise, a form of justice he had crafted over years. A man who sought to capture him would find his traps laid with an almost unnatural skill. Tripwires fashioned from vines and branches could fling a man against rocks or into hidden pits filled with jagged stakes. Hidden snares could dislocate limbs or immobilize a pursuer long enough for Jonah to appear silently behind them, blade in hand. Some who ventured too far north reported being stabbed, their weapons taken from them, their pride shattered, left bleeding and disoriented in the woods to make their way home, or die trying. There was a method to his brutality, an understanding of fear that few humans could wield. Jonah had become the embodiment of terror in the mountains, a dark guardian who could strike without warning and vanish without trace. But violence alone did not define him. Jonah's time in the mountains had also made him a shadowy protector of the weak, particularly those who had nowhere else to go. Runaways who stumbled into his territory found guidance in ways they never expected. He taught them how to move silently, how to avoid hunters, how to survive the winter months. Some of the young men and women he saved became apprentices of sorts, learning the same lessons Jonah had learned. The forest was cruel, but it was honest. It demanded respect, attention, and discipline. With his guidance, they too became phantoms of the woods, shadows that could move unseen, voices that could vanish into the wind. These acts of protection only fueled his legend, turning him from mere fugitive into myth. The townspeople's stories grew more elaborate as months turned into years. They claimed to see the Black Phantom leaping from ridge to ridge with impossible agility, scaling cliffs that seemed unclimbable, vanishing mid-air as if swallowed by the mountains themselves. Some spoke of glowing eyes in the darkness, of hands that appeared like smoke from trees to snatch a trespasser's rifle, of a shadow that moved faster than the human eye could follow. People began carrying charms or offerings when they ventured near the mountains, leaving food or trinkets to appease the Black Phantom, believing that acknowledgement might spare them from his wrath. Traders avoided routes that took them too close to his domain, and even hunters of the fiercest reputations spoke in hushed tones when recounting their encounters. Fear had become the currency of his legend, and Jonah wielded it like the weapon it had become. Despite the terror he inspired, Jonah was never motivated by cruelty alone. He did not kill for sport, he did not destroy without purpose. Every action was an extension of his survival, a demonstration of his refusal to allow himself to be subjugated again. He understood what it was to be hunted, to feel the weight of chains, the sting of leather, the cold certainty of death looming. That knowledge guided him. Every trap, every warning, every silent, shadowy approach was meant to preserve his freedom and punish those who would attempt to strip it from him. In this he became both feared and revered, a dark arbiter of justice, a mythic figure that communities could neither fully understand nor fully dismiss. At night, Jonah moved like smoke through the forest, his figure blending seamlessly into the darkness. He learned to anticipate patrol patterns, to predict which hunters would be reckless enough to enter his territory. He could appear where least expected and vanish before anyone knew he had been there. His reputation grew, and with it, so did the caution of those who dared enter the mountains. Many who went in with confidence left forever changed, haunted by glimpses of a dark figure that moved like a shadow and struck with the swiftness of a ghost. Others never returned, and rumors of their fate only enhanced the legend. The Black Phantom of the Peaks was no longer just a story whispered in fear. It had become a warning carved into the collective imagination of everyone living near the mountains. Merchants, hunters, and even soldiers began consulting each other, exchanging maps, notes, and observations. But no pattern ever emerged. The forest seemed alive in its defiance, every trick, trap, and shadow guided by a presence that was never where it should have been. Occasionally, fresh evidence would surface: a bloodied coat snagged on a branch, a rifle shattered into pieces, footprints that disappeared mid-step, and those who saw it understood that the mountains had their own rules now. Jonah's mastery over the terrain was absolute. His presence was never certain, yet always felt, a lingering fear that followed those foolish enough to enter his domain. The Black Phantom's infamy spread further as tales of miraculous escapes and disappearances circulated. People claimed to see the figure standing on cliffs silhouetted by the rising moon, watching silently before vanishing into the darkness. Others described a figure moving silently between the trees, stopping only to observe or strike with precise timing. Those who had survived encounters with him rarely spoke in detail, and when they did, their descriptions were full of awe, terror, and disbelief. Jonah's legend became a living entity, a story that demanded belief even from the most skeptical. And as the years passed, the line between man and myth blurred, until Jonah Briggs, the runaway slave, became indistinguishable from the dark guardian of the mountains who struck without mercy against anyone who threatened his hard-won freedom. Yet, amid all the terror and legend, the Black Phantom never lost his humanity completely. There were those few who stumbled into his domain seeking only refuge, and Jonah guided them carefully through the woods, showing them hidden paths, caves, and sources of water and food. He shared knowledge he had gained about the mountains, teaching them survival and self-defense, preparing them to disappear into the wilderness if the need arose. In these acts, Jonah was not a monster, he was a protector, a man who understood that the same fear that drove him to perfection in the mountains could also shield the vulnerable. These deeds, though quiet and unseen by the townsfolk, became another thread in the tapestry of his legend, a dual image of terror and salvation that only deepened his mythic presence. In time, Jonah Briggs became more than a man. He became a symbol. He was proof that a single individual could defy oppression, take vengeance on those who sought to harm him, and claim mastery over a landscape that seemed indifferent to human suffering. Every trap set, every hunter lost, every startled merchant and fearful patrol added to the aura of his invincibility. And yet, he remained rooted in purpose. His terror was not arbitrary. It was justice for the powerless, a warning for the arrogant, and a personal covenant with freedom that he would never relinquish again. Be the winter of 1843. Jonah Briggs was no longer a mere rumor whispered along the edges of lowland towns or among travelers making their way through the Carolina foothills. He had become a living legend, a figure whose presence was felt as much in the air, the soil, and the trees of the southern mountains, as it was in the minds of those who dared speak his name. The plantations that had once held him in chains seemed a distant nightmare, a memory that had been replaced with something far more formidable. Jonah's legend had carved itself into the spine of the South, stretching across ridges and valleys, rivers and cliffs, leaving an imprint that no man, soldier, or patrol could erase. Men who once sought to control others, men who wielded authority and violence as casually as they drew breath, found themselves suddenly diminished by the thought of entering his territory. Their confidence was no match for the knowledge that the mountains themselves were now his allies, and that Jonah Briggs had become a predator unlike any they had ever faced. Slave patrols, once relentless in their pursuit of runaways, began to falter. Stories of men disappearing into the mountains, of rifles shattered and boots torn apart by hidden traps, reached the ears of the overseers and constables who relied on intimidation and brute force to enforce their will. At first, these were dismissed as tall tales, exaggerations spread by frightened workers or those hoping to sow panic. But the evidence grew too tangible to ignore. Patrols returned with missing companions, shredded clothing snagged on brambles, weapons smashed or stolen, and whispers that a figure moved unseen, striking with deadly precision before disappearing as if swallowed by the forest itself. Fear replaced confidence, and the men who had once hunted without question now tread cautiously, always expecting the forest to answer back. Eventually, many patrols ceased their searches entirely, unwilling to risk life and limb against a foe they could neither see nor predict. The mountains themselves had become a wall of protection, and Jonah Briggs had become both its architect and its fiercest defender. Soldiers stationed in the region began to heed the tales with a mixture of skepticism and unease. Those who had previously patrolled the ridges near the foothills found themselves hesitating at the base of steep inclines, measuring every step with meticulous care. Even the bravest frontiersmen, accustomed to tracking wild game and evading the dangers of untamed wilderness, refused to camp near the passes and valleys Jonah had claimed as his own. Campfires were minimized, watch rotations doubled, and patrols avoided the areas where men had vanished or returned with accounts of a dark, shadowy figure moving impossibly across cliffs and through dense forests. The Black Phantom, as he was increasingly called, had reshaped the landscape from a place of passage into a realm of control, claiming the mountains as his dominion, and it was a dominion maintained not by conquest or occupation in the traditional sense, but by fear, skill, and an intimate understanding of the wilderness that only someone who had been hunted, broken, and forced to survive could possess. Yet Jonah Briggs's rule over his territory was governed by a principle he had learned in the long months of his flight and training. He did not attack without reason. The same man who could strike with deadly efficiency against hunters or would-be captors would also hesitate, weigh, and calculate the necessity of his actions. His violence was deliberate, precise, and born of a need for survival and protection, not cruelty. He understood the cost of overextension. He understood the delicate balance of being feared yet unseen, lethal yet just. When someone trespassed with intent to harm, to capture, or to enslave, Jonah acted swiftly, leaving no trace of mercy. But when the vulnerable or desperate wandered into his domain, he provided guidance, protection, and instruction. His interventions were as silent as his attacks, appearing and disappearing without acknowledgement, leaving those he helped alive, fed, and prepared for the treacherous paths of the mountains they had chosen or been forced to enter. Runaways who stumbled into his territory were met with careful observation at first. Jonah had no interest in being discovered unless necessary. He studied them from the shadows, learning their intentions, gauging their resolve and desperation, and judging their capacity to endure the hardships of the wilderness. Those he deemed capable of learning were given subtle guidance, a hidden path through dense underbrush, a cache of fresh water or edible roots, or a discreet sign that marked a safe passage through an otherwise treacherous gorge. He taught them to move like the shadows he had become, to listen to the wind and interpret the subtlest shifts in animal behavior as warnings or opportunities. Under his mentorship, these runaways learned not just to survive, but to vanish, becoming as elusive and invisible as Jonah himself had become in the months following his escape. They carried with them the knowledge of the Black Phantom, though rarely did they ever speak of him by name. It was safer, they quickly realized, to exist as though he had never been there, even though his influence lingered in every safe step, every hidden camp, and every survival tactic he had passed on. Through these actions, Jonah became a symbol far larger than any individual confrontation could explain. He was not simply a man who had escaped the chains of the lowlands. He was proof that one person could resist oppression, claim power over their environment, and impose boundaries that even the most determined aggressors could not breach. To the enslaved who had never seen a man like him, he represented hope, the possibility that defiance could be more than fleeting, that freedom could be sustained even in a world designed to crush it. To the hunters and patrols who had once ruled through terror, he represented a nightmare they could not contain, a constant reminder that the mountains themselves were now aligned against them. To all who moved through the region, he became the measure of what it meant to survive without compromise, to endure without surrender, and to fight with purpose when necessary. Jonah's presence was never static. He moved like smoke across the ridges, across rivers, and through dense thickets of forest, constantly testing himself and reinforcing the mastery he had built over months of hardship. He learned to anticipate the paths of hunters, the patrols of soldiers, and even the inadvertent movements of settlers, unfamiliar with the mountain's treacherous terrain. He discovered caves hidden behind waterfalls, paths that twisted beneath fallen trees, and cliffs that formed natural barriers, each feature serving as both sanctuary and instrument of control. Over time, he began constructing subtle traps, not always lethal, but effective in halting pursuers or scattering dogs trained to follow human scent. A simple tripwire could hurl a man into a thorned thicket. A camouflaged pit could capture a horse or force a hunter to retreat. Every element of the forest became part of his domain, part of the extension of his will, and part of the growing legend of the Black Phantom. The winter itself became both adversary and ally. Snow blanketed the mountain slopes, hardening the soil, masking tracks and muffling sounds. Jonah learned to read the snow as easily as he had learned to read the soil and leaves in warmer months. He could tell from the consistency of footprints the size, weight, and even the mood of those who traveled the mountain in winter. Snowdrifts became hiding places, ice-covered streams became boundaries, and the rhythm of falling snow became a signal for movement or rest. The cold, which would have killed an unprepared man in days, became a tool, a silent partner in his defense. Hunters unfamiliar with the terrain and the nuances of winter mountain survival quickly succumbed to frostbite, missteps, and exhaustion. Their failures reinforced the aura of invincibility surrounding Jonah, for the legend of the Black Phantom was intertwined with every misstep, every disappearance, and every snow-covered ridge that claimed the unwary. Yet Jonah never allowed the legend to define him completely. He remained pragmatic, grounded in the lessons he had learned when he first escaped into the wilderness. Every day he moved, hunted, and survived with meticulous attention to detail. Food was always carefully rationed, water carefully gathered, and shelter constantly improved to endure both storms and cold nights. He observed the behavior of animals to anticipate weather, locate prey, and avoid dangers that were invisible to human eyes. He practiced stealth constantly, ensuring that his presence could never be predicted, that his movements were always silent, and that his disappearance was absolute. His physical abilities, honed by months of relentless survival, were matched by an almost preternatural awareness of his surroundings. Every shadow, every rustle, every change in wind or snow became a signal he could read, interpret, and act upon with precision. The people he protected rarely saw him directly. Most encounters were indirect, a hidden trail leading them away from danger, a note carved into bark pointing to fresh water, or an abandoned cache of food in the snow. Those who did see him often spoke in hushed tones, describing a figure dressed in dark clothing, moving like the wind, appearing and disappearing without sound. The stories grew in the telling, and soon the Black Phantom of the Peaks became more than a person. He became the embodiment of defiance, of resistance, and of the wild itself. He was a symbol that the mountains belonged not to soldiers, not to hunters, not to overseers, but to those who could endure, adapt, and survive on their own terms. Jonah's impact extended beyond the immediate survival of runaways. The network of hidden paths, safe shelters, and survival strategies he established created a subtle form of resistance. Runaways learned to evade capture with knowledge he had imparted, returning later to assist others or to continue living outside the reach of oppression. His guidance was not a formal system, but it became a living method, passed through whispers and example, creating a chain of survival that reinforced the idea that the mountains were a sanctuary for those who dared claim their freedom. His lessons emphasized more than physical survival. They taught caution, observation, patience, and the understanding that fear could be weaponized and wielded without cruelty. That restraint could be as powerful as violence. By the close of 1843, Jonah Briggs' presence had fundamentally altered the way the South perceived the northern mountains. Soldiers marked certain ridges as impassable, slave patrols ceased attempting to penetrate deep into the forests, and even the most experienced frontiersmen avoided routes they once traveled with confidence. Rumors of his deeds traveled faster than the roads themselves. The hunter who vanished in a storm, the patrol whose horses bolted in the night, the merchant who stumbled into a hidden valley and emerged days later with frostbite and fear etched into every line of his face. Each story reinforced the other, building a legend that was impossible to ignore. And yet, the truth behind the legend remained simple. Jonah Briggs was a man who had refused to be hunted again, who had claimed mastery over his environment, and who had chosen to act with precision, intelligence, and purpose. He had entered the mountains as prey, a slave fleeing chains, and had emerged as the hunter, a figure who was impossible to capture, impossible to predict, and impossible to intimidate. His story was not written in the pages of books or the records of history. It was etched into the mountains themselves, carried in the cold wind, whispered in the forests, and reflected in the silence of snow-covered ridges. It lived in the eyes of those who survived his guidance, in the fear of those who sought to challenge him, and in the very land that had transformed a fugitive into a force of nature. Jonah Briggs had become more than a man. He had become a living testament to survival, defiance, and the power of mastering one's own destiny, and the legend of the Black Phantom of the Peaks would endure long after any of those who first whispered his name were gone.